He is a hero of our time.
Millions are indebted to him. Millions owe him their lives.
The man who averted a nuclear war. At 00:15, the word START lit up in bright red.
Petrov understood what would happen if he passed on this information.
There is a concept called retaliatory strike.
Potential there for mistake and misunderstanding was grave. It was very, very serious.
But I think it was fun to go with Stanislav and just see this country that he has almost been fighting against.
More and more letters were coming.
And then Kevin Costner.
Hello!
How come he's more famous in the West than in Russia?
He didn't consider himself to be a hero because it was his job.
Who is this guy and why is he living like that? If he saved the world, he should be world famous and rich.
Hello guys, we're in Marinki village, which is situated in Kaluga Oblast, about 120 kilometers away from Moscow. At first sight, it seems very unassuming, just row upon row of regular 5-story buildings. The population is just about 4,000 people, with 5 streets making up the village. It used to be a closed military town called Serpukhov 15, and it's precisely here that a nuclear war was prevented almost 40 years ago in 1983. While keeping watch at the command observation post of the missile defense alarm system, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov received a series of automated signals indicating that ballistic missiles had been launched from U.S. territory and that the Soviet Union was under attack.
I think that this is the closest we've come to accidental nuclear war.
We may all be alive today because Stanislav Petrov is who he is.
One man holding the fate of hundreds of millions of people in his hands. Pressure building up, time running out.
Deutschland, eine nukleare Wüste wäre es geworden. On behalf of the people in Washington, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, thank you for being on duty that night.
A few years later, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, this story broke in the West and made Petrov a celebrity there. He became the subject of a film and a book. Hollywood stars would come to meet him, for example, Robert De Niro and Matt Damon. He was even awarded a special World Citizen Award by the UN. Interestingly, not many people in Russia know the story of Stanislav Petrov. They aren't well versed in the circumstances of the night of September 25 to 26, 1983 either. Few people remember the events that were unfolding in 1983 or why it really felt like we were on the brink of a nuclear war. When I heard about this story, I realized that now, when the threat of a nuclear war has become real again, and everyone is discussing it, we just have to share with you the story of Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet lieutenant colonel who was brave enough to take on the responsibility of averting a war. It was the evening of September 25, 1983. Having taken with him a few sandwiches, tea, or rather tea leaves, and a sachet filled with sugar, a 44-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov exited the first entrance of the apartment building he lived in on Solkoskova Street, 18. He headed out to the bus stop where a beat-up shuttle bus was waiting for him. He was on his way to a regular graveyard shift. Actually, it was his day off, but Petrov agreed to step in for his colleague. As well as the 80 officers and soldiers that were under his command that night, he had his mind set on a calm working environment.
The crew accepted the shift. We were supposed to keep work until 8 a.m.
Most nights, that's a pretty boring job. Everything is sort of quiet. In fact, I think it could go on for years like that. But in this particular night, it didn't.
At 12:15 at night, an alarm went off at the command observation post, and the indicator board lit up with the word START in bright red. Meanwhile, another alarm went off and one more indicator board lit up next to the first one. It said missile attack. It meant that multiple missiles had been launched.
It was a tremendously nerve-wracking moment for the crew. Everyone was just looking between each other in bewilderment for 10, 15 seconds and trying to make sense of what had happened.
Petrov wusste, gibt jetzt die Meldung weiter.
Petrov understood what would happen if he passed on this information. It would most likely have reached Andropov directly, who would have ordered launchers to be put on full combat readiness. The Americans would have recorded that and started to prepare theirs. All hell would have broken loose.
The combat crew in the lower command and special data handling room started looking at my booth and waiting for my instructions. After a few moments, I collected myself and started giving orders.
Everything connected to that night and Petrov's work in general was classified for a long time. The story first resurfaced in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. Interestingly, it did so under very ironic circumstances. More on that later. Stanislav was born in Chernigovka village, Kamchatka Krai on September 7, 1939, 6 days after the start of World War II.
He spent his very happy childhood near Vladivostok and in Chita too. They moved around a lot because his father was a military man as well.
His father, Yevgraf Petrov, was posted to Odessa, and the whole family had to move yet again. According to Petrov's school certificate, he studied at school in Kotovsk, now known as Podolsk, Odessa Oblast.
He didn't want to become a military man, but a scientist. Later, he decided to follow in his father's footsteps, though.
Дело в том, что он в школе увлекался боксом, ну и там в детстве связался.
The thing is, he was fond of boxing when he was in school and fell in with the wrong crowd. My grandma was afraid that they would drag him into their mess. So the family suggested he enter a military college. My grandpa wasn't the one who tried to persuade him to do it. I believe it was my grandmother's idea to send him to a military college.
Right after graduating high school in 1957, Petrov enrolled in the Gomel Radio-Technical Air Defense College, but graduated from the Krasnoyarsk Radio-Technical College because the college was relocated.
He underwent on-the-job training in Kamchatka.
When did he meet your mother?
They met in Kamchatka. Mom studied cinema operation in Niro and was sent to Kamchatka to undergo training. That's where they met.
Stanislav married Raisa in Kamchatka. She, as they say, was the love of his life. Family, friends recall that the relationship between the spouses was very tender and affectionate.
I was born in 1970 when Dad was studying at Kiev Military College.
In 1967, Stanislav enrolled into the Kiev Higher Engineering Radiotechnical College, or KHIRKS. He graduated with an honors degree in management systems and programming.
A military technician with programming knowledge, meaning that he maintained stations. That's what he did at Serpukhov.
Upon graduating from the Kiev Radiotechnical College, Petrov started working as a senior engineer here in Serpukhov 15. By the way, this village was also called Kirillovo. This bus stop still has the same name. Behind this concrete fence, there used to be a checkpoint that marked the entrance to Serpukhov 15. 3 kilometers away from here, there is an unassuming Soviet-era building hidden behind the same concrete fence. It is, however, eye-catching because it is surrounded by these huge white spheres containing powerful antennas. It used to be a center that in Soviet times was very beautifully called the Center for the Observation of Celestial Bodies. In reality, it wasn't celestial bodies that were observed there. Instead, it housed the command observation post of the Missile Defense Alarm System. They observed U.S. territories using satellites with the sole purpose of registering ballistic missile launches from the U.S. before it was too late.
It was an army command post for the Missile Defense Alarm System, a place that tracked all signals from different alarm systems. It's where the signals were collected, and data would then be passed on to top government echelons.
They offered him a job and assured him that it would be very interesting. I believe he was really excited about working in a space-related field.
So he was enthusiastic about this task, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Once he got used to it, he really enjoyed it.
The officers who served at the command post lived in Serpukhov 15, as you already know. All the streets here, all named according to the Soviet tradition. Yubileinaya, Vesenaya, Koroleva, Gagarina, Tsolkovskovo, that's all of the streets. At different times, Petrov lived on the streets that are named after the conquerors of space. As he moved up the ranks, he was given better and better apartments. As Petrov himself recalled, life in Serpukhov 15 was decent or even nice. It's no surprise because it was a closed town that was on special maintenance. In the Soviet times, when there was an extreme shortage of everything, special maintenance was a saving grace. The town was enclosed with a fence, the remnants of which are still visible. We've now exited the town and wandered into the outer world. At the time, the only way you could enter or exit the town was through the checkpoint. Of course, the people who served there had no right to share any details about what they were working on when they left the town. Moreover, the officers couldn't discuss anything work-related with their families when they clocked out. It was classified.
В то время был секрет, конечно. Мы относились к каким войскам? То к ракетчикам, кто к летчикам. И только в 90-е годы нас наконец-то рассекретили и сказали, что мы ВКС, это воздушно-космические силы.
Это была очень секретная тема, но...
It was highly classified, but we assumed it had something to do with space. But the specifics would stay unknown. We had our own interests as kids, so we didn't think about it too much. Well, it's work, so what about it? Of course we liked to misbehave when we were kids. We used to sneak into the 2 military posts that were in the town. We would go to the soldiers' tea room and buy sweets from them. They had a billiard table where we would play in the summertime. The Nara River is 2 or 3 kilometers away from here, where we would go for a swim.
Вообще, атмосфера в части была очень хорошая тогда. Очень хорошая, да. Все, я не знаю, все друг другу помогали. Вот. Дисциплина была достаточно хорошая. Я помню, сирена вот 9 часов гудит. Такой топот по городку. Дети бегут домой.
А зачем сирена гудит?
Кто ее знает?
I got into the system in 1972. Back then there were only bare walls. I fully participated in the installation of equipment and the development of combat systems.
The new Russian warning system was composed of 9 satellites that had a view of the Earth's surface over America. Any launch from there should have been detected quickly by observing the rocket plumes over the horizon, or so went the Russian theory.
The United States started developing their own program. Eventually, in the 70s, the Soviet Union also started working on the creation of an early warning space echelon system.
The system in question was OKA, a program that was put on full alert in 1982. Its main purpose was to detect a U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile launch in a timely manner.
A ballistic missile is a missile that consists of fuel, oxidizer, and certain combustibles. It doesn't depend on oxygen and only utilizes jet propulsion power to gain speed. Then, at a certain point, it lets its destructive payload fall free. All this means that they can provide the re-entry vehicle with a level of acceleration that allows for an intercontinental ballistic missile launch.
By that time, the USSR had already developed its own early warning systems, but they had to do with the so-called ground echelon, not a space one. Actually, I'm talking about basic radar stations. A radio signal is sent, it reverberates off of an object so that you can see it on the screen and be informed about its bearing angle and speed. The main issue with radar systems in relation to ballistic missiles is obvious. Radar can detect such a missile just 10-15 minutes before its arrival. The moment a missile comes within the radar's detection distance, it's too close to the target.
The idea behind this was that since they could now detect a missile launch mere seconds after it had been launched, they had more time. So, if we're talking about a missile launch from United States territory, it would take 30 minutes for it to reach Soviet territory. And that's true both ways.
You have the satellite has to see something. It has to turn it into a mathematical formula. It has to send the data down to Earth. The computer has to process it.
The main principle is that the sensors operate by detecting infrared radiation emitted by the engine.
You have to understand that what they were watching was not sort of like what we see in video today. You know, this wasn't the atmosphere that could detect the infrared heat from a rocket engine if the rocket was rising, and they could detect it against the blackness of space.
One satellite would be positioned in orbit in a way that allowed for launch detection 8 hours a day. So you needed 3 of them to cover the 24-hour period.
Stanislav Petrov is not permanently assigned to sit in that chair every night. He's the deputy commander of the place, and he's an expert on the algorithm. His job normally was to work on the algorithms that this computer used to, his job was to study the mathematics, make the system work better, but he needed a couple of on-duty nights to appreciate the hardware.
He was on duty just a couple of times a month, wasn't he? Plus, he would sometimes be called to fill in for someone. Why didn't he have more shifts?
The thing was, there were a lot of officer personnel. Apparently, the duty roster was planned out specifically so that every officer could perform combat standby duty. I don't know who he filled in for. Maybe someone got sick. But he did tell me this. I'm filling in for someone today. It's an unscheduled shift.
So he puts on his uniform. It's a very plush. He sits in a chair. It's an armchair. And he's looking out at a big window. And beyond the window, North Dakota are where the American missiles are. And of course, this big map with the help of the satellite and other satellites would track any possible missile launch.
I remember receiving a call from Dad that night. He said, "I'm staying after hours. We have an emergency." That's it. He mentioned seeing a UFO and some system malfunctioning. It was a rough shift.
There was an alert. And this alert was on the big board in front of him in letters that said "start," that the satellite had picked up something and the computer had found something that looked like a missile.
The sound alarms and lighting were overwhelming. They all burst out so suddenly, it was extremely nerve-wracking.
The thing is going beep, start, alert. And again, Petrov is not laid back, right? He's not having a cigarette or anything. He is alert, and he's trying to figure out what is really going on here.
It's an interesting thing that, as far as I understand, Soviet developers and military personnel were very proud of the fact that the data processing was performed by a computer. At the same time, there was a healthy amount of skepticism about all the algorithms and automated systems.
We also had a kind of visual department. Besides the computerized processing, we had operators looking at screens that showed US territory. In certain circumstances, they would detect launches with high accuracy.
Time and time again, Petrov addressed the command post staff who were conducting visual observation via cameras installed on the satellite. But they could neither confirm nor deny the launch. Why? First of all, the equipment was very basic. Obviously, it can't be compared to television cameras we have today. On top of that, the missile deployment area surveilled by the Soviet satellites was going through the so-called terminator zone, the dividing line between the day and night sides of the planet. Therefore, the visibility in the terminator zone was even lower.
Стоит мне подтвердить эту атаку, погибнет много людей.
Beide Supermächte waren im Alarmzustand. Sie hatten sich die Pistole an die Schläfe gesetzt. Die Raketen standen nur noch Minuten vor dem Start.
In only a matter of minutes. 1983 had a period called the War Scare, and the potential there for mistake and misunderstanding was grave. It was very, very serious.
As always, it's important to understand the context of the events and times amid which Petrov's shift took place. This happened at the height of the Cold War between the USA and the USSR. The Cold War hinged on the so-called strategy of mutually assured destruction. This concept was first introduced by the U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in the early 60s. The idea behind this was that both the U.S. and the USSR had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the enemy in case one of them decided to attack.
После окончания Карибского кризиса 1962
After the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which saw the world on the brink of World War III, the tensions between the USSR and the US started lessening. But then Khrushchev was removed from his post as the first secretary, and Brezhnev assumed his position. The USSR began ramping up weapon production, and tensions started running high again. Interestingly, both superpowers at the time assumed that the enemy was ready to strike first for the sake of winning the nuclear war. It was a belief both the Soviets and the Americans perpetuated in regard to each other.
This idea was, first of all, came from some of our conservative thinkers, and they looked at Soviet behavior and they tried to interpret what that behavior would be. And we did have people that said the Soviets were building in order to fight and win a nuclear war.
Я не думаю, что в советской военной доктрине
I don't think that the Soviet military doctrine suggested an unprovoked nuclear strike against the United States. A retaliatory strike, sure. A means of containment, of course. But I don't think they ever planned for a direct attack against the United States. At least, I have seen no mention of it in any documents.
At the time, the notion of the US being evil and us being its number one enemy was the only thing discussed on the news. The arms race was in full swing, and we were increasing the defensive capabilities of our country. Not for the sake of attacking, but for the sake of our defensive capabilities. Naturally, if they invented something new, we had to come up with our own thing too.
In 1976, the Soviet leaders decided to place a new generation of missiles, the RSD-10 Pioneer, in the western part of the USSR. It was a middle-range missile. In several minutes, it could hit any Western European country with a fairly high precision.
Ich bin Jahrgang 1954.
I was born in 1954. I'm not a child of the war. However, I'm a child of the Cold War. I was raised in fear of Russians. I thought that someday they would come and introduce this horrible communism here in West Germany. When I grew a little older, my fear of Russians was replaced by a fear of possible nuclear war. You may know that in the 1980s there was an active peace movement in West Germany. We'd go out on the streets to protest against the installation of US middle-range Pershing II missiles because we thought it would mirror the Cuban Missile Crisis. From an Allies' territory, the Americans could launch a nuclear missile that would reach Moscow in 8 minutes.
Starting in the 1980s, when the Soviet troops were sent to Afghanistan up to perestroika. These 5 years were extremely difficult. Reagan took office in the United States. He was a person who took a firm position regarding the Soviet Union.
Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And again, this had ratcheted up the tensions.
I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God.
The first half of the 1980s was probably one of the most difficult periods in Moscow-Washington relations.
By 1982, the nuclear arsenal of both superpowers possessed the destructive power of 1 million Hiroshima bombs. Out of concern that the U.S. could destroy the Soviet leadership in one hit, the USSR developed a system that would guarantee a counterstrike even in that scenario. The system is called perimeter. However, it's known as the dead hand in the press. The point is that in that case, a computer would make the decision to strike.
You understand what the dead hand is. It's creating mechanisms that would guarantee a retaliatory strike even in the event the whole leadership was incapacitated. And the missiles would hit most of the infrastructure and so on. It's possible that some elements of this system did exist. But to what extent was it complete and conceptual? That's hard to say.
On March 23, 1983, the American President Ronald Reagan announced the creation of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. It was a multi-component defense system of the American territory from the Soviet ballistic missiles. It's partly based on surface, partly underwater, and partly in space. Because of that, and also of the ambitiousness and cost of this project, it was soon nicknamed Star Wars, a reference to the famous films that had come out a while before that.
But the point is that all these things happened in 1983. So you had Evil Empire, Star Wars, the airliner being shot down, the Western missiles being stationed.
In the early 1980s, the situation around Soviet air borders was rather tense. American airplanes would come almost too close to them. Sometimes they would even cross the border for a while. Clearly, they were checking how the Soviet air defense would behave. One such instance happened in April 1983 near the Kuril Islands. American planes flew over the Zelony Island. The Soviet Air Defense Command got reprimanded big time, and Dropov gave a strict warning that this couldn't happen again. This tense atmosphere led to a great tragedy. On September 1, 1983, a Korean air passenger Boeing 747 was in the middle of a flight from New York to Seoul with a refueling stop in Anchorage, Alaska. The 23 crew members and 246 passengers were on board. That included Larry McDonald, an American senator. The Boeing was supposed to use the R-20 route according to the flight plan. It was the northernmost of the 5 air corridors designed for passenger flights. It was the closest to the Soviet Union. Soon after the takeoff from Anchorage, the pilots made a fatal mistake. According to the investigators, they entered the wrong autopilot parameters without noticing. They didn't control what was going on. The Boeings of that period didn't have modern navigation systems. The planes swerved to the north of the R-20 corridor. 5 hours after the takeoff, they were 296 kilometers away from the point which the crew believed they were, and which they reported to the dispatcher. In fact, they were 300 kilometers up north above Soviet territory. Another tragic coincidence. That day, they were planning to test a new Soviet ballistic missile. It was supposed to be launched from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome and hit a target on the Kamchatka-Kura polygon. Because of that, American RC-135 spy planes would always fly near Kamchatka shores. They would use their instruments to watch the missile in flight. An RC-135 also circled near the Soviet borders in that area. All these mistakes and coincidences converged, and the irredeemable happened. The Soviet air defense officers saw a foreign airplane on their screens. They believed it was an American RC-135 spy plane, which was already above Kamchatka, and raised the Su-15 fighter jet. The Su-15 fighter jet was flown by Gennady Osipovich, a seasoned pilot. At 4:30 a.m., he got close to the Boeing and said that he had seen anti-collision lights like all passenger planes have. That message was ignored on the ground. He was ordered to fire warning shots from the cannon. Osipovich complied. No reaction followed. Later, he confessed that since it wasn't tracer ammunition and it was at night, the Boeing pilots might not have noticed anything. At 3:24 a.m., Osipovich was ordered to destroy the target. At 3:25 a.m., an air-to-air R-98 missile hit the passenger plane. Osipovich reported. The Boeing fell into the La Perouse Strait. All 269 people on board died. Osipovich had followed orders. A media firestorm, or rather a media hysteria, raged in the West. The hawks called for a reply. Don't forget that a U.S. senator was one of the dead Boeing passengers. Reagan blamed the USSR for the deliberate destruction of the airplane. In Moscow, they considered admitting their mistake at first, but later they decided to deny everything. And only in 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev will apologize for what happened. Then Yeltsin will repeat the apologies when handing over the black box of the Boeing to the Koreans for an investigation.
Man hat eben geglaubt, die Amerikaner testen Abwehrsysteme.
Someone believed that the Americans were testing the air defense systems, and they ordered the fighter jets to destroy the plane. An order is an order, after all. There were 300 passengers in the plane, men, women, children. But still, an order is an order. Petrov realized that he could give an order and no one would question that decision.
Stanislav Petrov was put in the perfect emotional storm by a complete accident. When I talked to him about nuclear war, he understood what the risks were. He understood what was going on. But also, he was actually rather Soviet leadership. You know, he realized that, especially in the period of Brezhnev's stagnation and then in the period of Andropov, that there was a lot of things happening at the high levels that were sort of silly. And so he was not ignorant. He wasn't some blind soldier marching off. He was a regular person like you or me, and he saw what everybody else saw, and it wasn't pretty.
Was your father a member of the party?
Yes. Because in the Soviet Union, he could forget about his career growth if he wasn't in the party. He joined the party, but frankly, I don't know how much he believed in all of that. He didn't like talking about it, to tell you the truth. It was merely a necessity.
Do you remember what he thought about America?
He didn't think anything about it. Because he understood that a peaceful country wouldn't want all this aggravation.
We have discussed this matter. I know that a strike that prevents a missile attack, we consider it the beginning of a war. We would respond immediately.
He told me that his legs felt like he was sitting on a frying pan. He was very, very nervous. It doesn't happen very often that the computer makes a mistake like this with 5 missiles. So he picked up the phone and he called his superiors. And this was the moment of truth. And he said to them, look, my judgment is this is a false alarm. This is not a missile launch.
It's a false alarm. There is no missile.
These were the most stressful 18 minutes in Stanislav Petrov's life. If it was a mistake and the American missiles were indeed on their way, the Soviet radar stations would detect them in 18 minutes. 18 minutes passed. The radar station didn't see anything. Petrov didn't make a mistake.
It took a lot of courage. Well, that was his gut's opinion. He was right.
I knew that there are thousands of missiles on active duty, minimum 2 or 3 on the position. 5 missiles were launched. If the US wanted to start a war against us, they wouldn't be limited to 5 missiles.
I wouldn't rule that out completely. I don't think Petrov would rule it out either. We can talk about how it is technically possible to launch several missiles, and you can't rule it out completely.
I know what defense system they have in the missile bases. Some maniac won't be able to launch a missile.
Petrov knew that things had been rushed and they were trying to work out the kinks. He knew that because they were behind, because the United States, the other superpower, their competition had a more advanced system. The Soviet leaders were very eager to get this system working, and they told Petrov, look, it's new, it might have some glitches, it might, have some problems, so let's get it working and we'll fix it later.
There is a version that the sun's rays were reflected by the clouds, or it was some program glitch. The algorithm worked incorrectly. The military wrote in their reports that there was such a problem. There were false alarms, and we tried to cope with that.
Such false alarms had happened before as well, only they happened in the early warning radar station command centers. One of the most famous occasions took place in October 1960. North American Aerospace Defense Command got a signal from a Greenland-based early warning station about a mass Soviet nuclear strike targeting the U.S. It was a matter of minutes, but the officers who worked with the data suspected something wrong. Nikita Khrushchev was visiting New York City that day. He was invited at the UN General Assembly. It was the strangest possible timing to start a nuclear war. It turned out later that the American radar system had given a false alarm because it had caught a radio signal that was reflected from the moon. This was the first false alarm in the history of the nuclear race. It didn't have any consequence either, but we see how different the contexts were. Back then, Khrushchev was in New York, so it was easy to suppose that it was a system error. And in the early 1980s, everything was on the verge of war. The situation was far more serious.
There is a concept of a retaliatory strike. You get the information that the missiles are coming your way and you have to respond. If it was about a counterattack by the United States, there would be very little time. I believe that it would be difficult to make a collective decision in such conditions. In any case, someone had to press that button, and of course it had to be the leader of the country.
I don't know for sure who he reported to, but it went up the chain of command.
Then he just absolved himself of the responsibility. The system went off, I reported it, it's not my fault.
It's not like it's not his fault, it's just a military order.
I mean that if he had acted differently, he would have gotten off the hook, but he was in the military, so he complied.
What would happen then? No one would be able to judge him? When he came back 3 days later, when the investigation was over, he slept for 2 days straight to get some rest.
After all that stress.
Seems like he lost a lot of nerve cells back there.
The same night, Yuri Votintsev, a colonel general who commanded Soviet air defense, looked into the situation, listened to all the reports, and thanked Petrov for the clever actions. It's finally over. Everyone expected that they would promote, if not reward, Petrov. He was also expecting some incentive. But time passed, a special committee investigated that system failure. And it unexpectedly found a failure in Petrov's work. What was the problem, you'll ask? Oh, it's an awesome story, a typical Soviet one. So Petrov had a combat log where he had to write down the commands he gave and received. And since in that critical situation he didn't have time for that, in his memoirs he said, "How could I do it? I had a receiver which I was using to report in one hand, and in the other hand I was holding a microphone where I had to give commands." So, there were blank spaces in the combat log. That's what they pointed out to Petrov. And this Colonel General Votintsev gave him a hard time.
He could have been a little offended by those who saw what he had done, who promised to reward or promote him but didn't do that. Because the military always believes that you must follow all orders without a second thought. That's because the army can't work if one small person starts thinking and doing what they think is right. He told me about a meeting. I don't remember the year, but 1 or 2 years after that, the whole military had a meeting and got some rewards. But his troops didn't. He was very hurt by that.
About a year after the scandal with the higher-ups, Petrov was transferred to the reserves. He didn't connect these events himself. He said that he had quit because he was tired and wanted to spend more time with his wife. Raisa was seriously ill back then.
She had problems with her blood pressure. Her health depended on the weather and other conditions a lot. She could be feeling great for weeks. She could be living a normal life. Then she could have a seizure and almost be hospitalized. It was mostly me who spent most time with my mother. I would come back from school and spend time with her. Father was on duty. Only when he quit, he could take care of her at home.
In order to transfer Petrov into the reserves, it said, during his service, Petrov SE proved himself as a politically literate officer with good military and technical training. They thanked him for his many years of service and gave him an honorary certificate. They also rewarded Petrov with a third-class order for service to the homeland in the armed forces of the USSR.
I think he got tired of it.
Did he?
Or the term of his service was ending. It was 25 years. That period had ended, and he thought there was no point continuing.
In 1986, Petrov had to move out of the flat in Serpukhov 15, and after the many years of service, he could choose where he wanted to live. There was such a rule in the Soviet army. And after giving it some thought, Petrov and his wife chose Fryazino. The thing is that Petrov's sister-in-law lived in this town near Moscow. That's why they decided to move here. They got a flat here in 1986. Now Petrov's son lives there.
In 1993, when Dmitry Lakhanov, from a paper called Top Secret came, we told him about everything in detail.
The Soviet people learned about it only 10 years later, since it was top secret information. It was never disclosed. Even my wife found out about it from newspapers 10 years later.
Why was it forbidden to say anything about it for 10 years?
We have always liked secrets in Russia and the Soviet Union. We are a rather closed country.
In the Military Historic magazine dated October 1993, they published the story about that shift and the false alarm. Who do you think wrote that article? That very Colonel General Yuri Votintsev, who had lectured Petrov for not having filled out the combat log. He also could be one of the reasons why Petrov had quit. Apparently, he felt conscience-stricken, because this is what he wrote. It's a no-brainer what choice the country's leadership and armed forces had to make that night. Fortunately, the operational duties in the command center were carried out by a true professional, the Combat Algorithms Deputy Division Chief Lieutenant Colonel and Engineer S.E. Petrov. After an immediate analysis of the situation, he didn't allow the erroneous information to be given out.
The article came out in 1993, and that's it. Everyone held their breaths for a moment, up until 1998. It was forgotten.
In 1998, 5 years after Votensev's publication, a small article came out in Bild, a German newspaper. It was called "A Person Who Prevented a Nuclear Disaster, Poor and Sorrowful." That's what it said. This article got into Karl Schumacher's hands. He lives here, in a town called Oberhausen, not far away from Dusseldorf. He's a unique person. He owns a family funeral business. He is a highly passionate person. He read that article. First, he thought it was all made up. Then, he made some inquiries and realized it was the truth. As someone who grew up in the Cold War atmosphere, anticipating that Russian missiles could come here and kill him personally, and as someone who was thankful because that didn't happen, he realized he had to find Petrov. Find and meet him, especially since he was poor and sorrowful.
Ich habe mich dann an die Zeitung gewandt.
I wrote to the newspaper and found its editor. After that, I called to Hanover, Hamburg and Berlin, then to London, Manchester and Moscow. I spent 2 weeks on those calls.
Und irgendwann, 14
Then I found the London journalist who was first to write about that incident there. He gave me the Fryazino address.
Fryazino.
My father was always a talkative person, and when he came to Fryazino, he would talk to the neighbors if they started the conversation. Just going out to sit on a bench and talk. He read a lot. He liked solving crossword puzzles. He played chess as well. He taught me to play chess too. He didn't start conversations though.
It wasn't easy to get a smartphone back then. Stanislav Petrov didn't have the money to buy one. His neighbor had a phone. We kept in touch through her. The only way to do it was to come by myself, knock on the door, and hope that he is at home. I had to fly from Dusseldorf to Vienna. Then, with Russian Aeroflot, I flew to Moscow. I thought, if I'm lucky, he will be at home. If I'm not lucky, I'll go to the surrounding areas where he could have gone to. Maybe he went out for a walk, or to the hospital. Maybe he's doing shopping. If we fail completely and we don't find him anywhere, we'll try later. Or maybe not. Maybe he doesn't even exist. Or I got the wrong information. So we went there. We were fortunate enough to meet him.
What was his reaction when he saw you? What did you say to him?
I remember the first words I said very well. We knocked on the door. I don't remember if he had a doorbell, but I know we knocked. Suddenly the door opened and we saw Stanislav Petrov. We knew it was him at once. He looked the same as on the photo in the newspaper. We still asked him if he was Stanislav Petrov.
Mr. Petrov?
He said yes and nodded. I told him, in English, we came from Germany. We want to say thank you, not more.
We want to say thank you, not more.
He laughed. He opened the door a bit wider and said, "Come in." Everything was clear. He treated us to some instant coffee. I also remember that he had an icon hanging on the wall.
What language did he speak with Schumacher in?
My father learned English. Carl also spoke English. That was their lingua franca.
Wow, cool. When did he learn English?
Just at home for his overall development.
We didn't talk about that night and about the time he made that decision and how critical the situation was. Not at all. We talked about his life, what he was doing for a living, where his children were. We talked about simple things. It was during that talk that I got the idea to invite him to my place. I didn't plan it beforehand at all.
Das hat wohl mit ins Grab genommen.
Schumacher invited Petrov to Germany for a return visit. Petrov accepted the invitation, but he didn't have a passport. Besides, he had been an officer with a high clearance level not long ago. Could he even get documents like this and leave the country? Then the classic story of Oblomov and Stoltz started. Oblomov was, of course, Petrov. He wanted to go, but he didn't know how to organize all that. He stayed at home looking out of the window without hoping for anything, and Schumacher took the role of Stoltz. He started all the organization, made inquiries, tried to help Petrov get a passport and a German visa, sent him money and paid for the flight. So, after 6 months of bureaucratic hell, Petrov arrived here at the Dusseldorf airport and then to Oberhausen, where Schumacher met him. And for 2 weeks, he entertained him, showed him around, and introduced him to everyone as a real celebrity.
Ich wollte ja, dass kommen kann.
I wanted to make that trip happen, so he could tell everyone about what had happened, so the decision he made that night wasn't forgotten.
Nicht und seine Entscheidung in der Nacht, dass sie nicht in Vergessenheit gerät.
He took him to concerts, soccer matches, even to children's amusement park. We got this funny photo because it was quite unusual for someone from the Soviet Union.
He talked about Karl's family, how they walked around the town. They took him to schools, and he told German children and teenagers about the incident.
The main thing was that Schumacher told every journalist he could reach out to that the person who had saved them all had come.
The fact that the Cold War could become hot was deliberately concealed from us by the politicians and the military. Today, Stanislav Petrov, the officer who prevented World War III, is a humble person and an unsung hero who lives in a town near Moscow.
I was reading a newspaper about, a Danish journalist who was working in Russia for many years. And she was writing the story about a man who saved the world from nuclear war. But it's like these short stories, 1 page maximum. But I saw one picture, it looks very scruffy, the area. So I was like, who is this guy? And why is he living like that? If he saved the world, he should be world famous and rich, of course. But apparently he wasn't.
Господин Петров, мы все еще надеемся, что вы согласны дать нам интервью по поводу происшествия с ядерным оружием.
This was a clip from a film called The Man Who Saved the World. Coincidentally, its title sounds almost the same as the famous song by David Bowie. A lot of people remember Kurt Cobain singing it. It was a documentary drama, a film containing stage scenes like in feature films. They are called reconstructions. I have filmed a lot of documentary dramas myself, but believe me, this movie is absolutely unique. It's not because of the staging quality, it's quite normal. It's because Petrov plays himself in these reconstructions. I mean, the documentary parts, Petrov participates himself. And in the reconstructed parts, elderly Petrov is played by elderly Petrov. Young Petrov is played by a different actor. It's so unique. You are watching and can't tell how a retired Soviet officer agreed to play himself in a movie, swear, and smoke on camera, and kick the production team out take after take. And how it is mixed with the documented story of the real Petrov.
So I just collected a small film crew and pretended we were doing commercials in Russia. And suddenly all the roads just disappeared. It was just dirt roads. And it must have been around, the winter time. It was very cold. So I was sitting here with my big European jackets, dune jacket, what they call it, big jackets on. Very poor people walking with no shoes on, just walking around drinking. I was like, whoa, what is this area? I remember when we landed with the car there, nobody knows he was home because, it was like, I think he was used to, people come in for a couple of hours. It could be from a British organization. Would you save the world? Well, I did not. Okay, thank you. Leave. But when I came into his house, I'm always more interested in, the people behind what happened. Of course, I had this fixation about, a guy saving the world from nuclear war. But at the same time, how did he end up like this, I remember that day we were sitting down there and we were starting drinking beers from the local, they were selling chickens outside, livestock chickens. Mm-hmm. And inside they just had a little bit of alcohol and cigarettes. And I remember he told me two things because I came there just to hear about, how dangerous it was and about his family situation. You have to understand, I'm a Russian colonel. We don't talk about family, don't talk about emotions. It's never gonna happen.
Those who saw Petrov in his final years say that his apartment here in Fryazino was messy and cluttered, something that we might describe now as the refuge of a sociopath. Again, Petrov was an introvert, reluctant to socialize, and even though 3 of his former colleagues lived with their families here in Fryazino, he hardly ever saw them.
I had a feeling that nothing had been cooked or cleaned there for many months. At the same time, I thought I didn't want to do anything, even indirectly, to make him feel ashamed. I respected him.
He lives on the $55 a month state pension. He literally lives in a scrap, in the old squalid block of flats.
Did he really live so poorly in this messy apartment?
He received a pension of 1,000 rubles. He didn't need to pay for housing. He had his own apartment. As I've already said, he didn't have a phone, and the heating was very cheap. So he had 950 rubles to live on, which isn't bad. He said that for a few months before that, he had not been paid a pension at all.
Und wenn jetzt unter diesen Zuständen lebt,
seeing him living in such conditions made me very sad. I've now come to understand that elderly Russian men, or rather, elderly men in the post-Soviet space are often helpless if they live without a woman.
Sind sie oft sehr hilflos.
Did his wife's death hit him hard?
Very hard. He spent more time talking about how he wanted to save his wife from this disease than about his own feelings about September 26th.
He talked more about his wife.
Yeah, he talked about her death. He said that he had left home, come back, and she was just not there anymore.
So we had 3 weeks there with Stanislav, and the main purpose was to get very friendly there. But we had very also problems because suddenly he would just freak out, if we just pushed him too much with the questions.
В интервью не должно быть ни единого слова о моей матери.
But I understood that I had to do that. I mean, I had to be a little bit evil, a little bit mean. I had to go that distance to get closer to his story.
Did you understand from the start, from the very beginning, that you're going to film himself as a character? Or at the beginning it's just an interview?
Not at all. It started very cinéma vérité. It started off like, let's just do like you're doing now.
Like a documentary?
Yeah, documentary. Take an interview, film him. And then suddenly I realized I cannot get the true story here. Because as soon as I put up the camera, he's like, and he said something different. Then becomes this TV person like, I never said that. That's not dangerous. I have no problems, You become like that. And actually, I think it's very Russian also. They're very, very proud people, the people that I work with.
So how the idea of the reenactments appeared first?
It started off after 3 weeks. I was like, how can I get through to this? Because everybody, of course, wants to hear his true emotion during that moment when the missile was supposed to rain down on Russia. And he told me behind the camera, I'm very persuasive. And pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and then some also becoming his friend. When people ask me about how much time I spent with Stanislav, I don't know.
Most of the time they were filming something here. Something was filmed in my town. My father often did not want to see them. Then they had their own problems. There were some scheduling conflicts.
It took Peter Anthony almost 10 years to film his docudrama, not as a result of Petrov's disagreeable character, but because of the money. This story was expensive to film, and they were constantly having to raise more funding. Anthony turned to all sorts of European cinema and cultural organizations, which always takes much time. You have to make presentations, show your scripts, so the process was drawn out. Fun fact, Anthony said that if he was filming it today, it would have been much faster, because there are streaming platforms. They provide large amounts of money easily for you to film away. And Anthony says, if I was to film it now, what a movie it could be. Full and complete compensation for Mr. Petrov's participation in the film and for all other rights is $3,000 US. $500 US will be paid upon signing. The rest will be paid in such and such rates on such and such dates.
It cost around $5,000 back then. But it was not a feature film.
In 2004, $5,000 was good money.
He did not actually agree for the sake of money. At first, it just seemed interesting to him. But then they demanded some sort of artistic performance of him. Well, of course, it was hard at first, but then he got used to it. He stopped noticing the cameras and everything started going smoothly.
You gave him a text, an actual text, which...
Something that he said himself. He would say something, then I would write down what he said, and then we'd come back and make him say it again. And something he would say it, and we got a camera, and then we got some off camera, and then I had to get it back again. So he actually got, kind of timed exit, because normally he was not off camera, he was not off guard. He would always know what he was said before, It was a crazy process.
Мир никогда не был так близок к катастрофе, как именно в этом 1983 году.
Stanislav Petrov, the hand holding the earth symbolizes your heroic decision made on September 26, 1983, for which you earn the title of the man who saved the world from nuclear war. In 2006, Petrov was awarded the World Citizen Award for his service to humanity in the UN headquarters. It was his first visit to the United States and perhaps his first speech in front of a large audience. He spent his whole life in closed military stations, so he was a military man, not a speaker. Therefore, he was clearly shy about giving a speech. First, he was speaking in Russian with the help of a translator.
Трудность заключалась в том, что я не был на 100% уверен в правильности своего решения. У меня были большие сомнения.
Then Petrov switched to what English he knew, but spoke with a strong accent.
I was just at the right place at the right time.
Тут нам с вами, друзья, важно сделать оговорку.
Here, our friends, we need to consider this within a modern context. Now, if we imagine that a former combat officer goes to America, to New York, and receives some kind of award here in Russia, he will be a traitor, just as it would have been considered treason in Soviet times. But we're talking about the 90s and the early 2000s, when relations between Russia and America were completely different. Back then, everyone thought that the times when the two countries looked at each other through the scope of a rifle were gone for good. The story of Soviet officer Petrov and his act was published in the global media, including Der Spiegel, Die Welt, CBS, Washington Post.
Приходило все больше и больше писем.
He kept getting more and more letters, but the return addresses were so difficult that he stopped replying because he didn't know where to send them. Somehow, all of these letters reached him, even though the addresses on them were shortened down to something like Freyazino, 25 kilometers from Moscow, for Stanislav Petrov.
That's crazy. That was the first time I met Stanislav. I was there for 3 weeks. I remember that. Then Stanislav, he comes in with a big plastic bag, garbage bag, filled with we call it letters. Jocelyn, 12 years old, you saved my life. I'll donate $1, And Sunny, that was like, I think it was Paramount Pictures. I can't remember the company, something like that. Like, whoa, what is this? And then Kevin Costner.
He sent him a thank you letter and I think $20 or something like that. So he started replying to all these letters.
So, like Kevin Costner sent him $20 for saving the world?
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe he was afraid that it wouldn't get there. A lot of people sent money to him, even from England. Someone sent him £5. Most people were just afraid to put a lot of money in the envelope. But Costner didn't care if it got lost.
And then he was like, how is your connection with Kevin Costner? And he said he wrote him this letter, and then he told me that Kevin Costner was his favorite movie star. Stanislav was a big fan of Kevin Costner. And I found out it's because Kevin Costner, first of course, he looked good. He thinks he looked like Stanislav. Sure, he said maybe he was a movie star, but still like he was in hot spot during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Stanislav was during the Cold War with America. So I have two wishes. One wish is to come to the United States to get his award, and the other one to meet Kevin Costner. And I think it took one day, and then they were calling us, Of course we can meet.
Hello!
Здравствуйте.
How are you?
Хорошо.
Welcome.
Спасибо.
Yes. How do we fix all this? How do we make it safe? And tell him to remember he's king of the world, so he should talk like a king.
Oh.
Yes.
For the sake of this meeting with Costner, Petrov and a film crew went to the USA. They had to find funds for this trip. News spread like wildfire. The American film industry people heard of the story of the man who had saved the world and that he was coming to see Costner. And then when Petrov got to America, producers invited him to drop by their film sets to meet other stars.
They brought him to the studio. Robert De Niro was there. Matt Damon was also working on some film there. My father had heard of De Niro. As for Matt Damon, he had never heard of him at all. He could barely pronounce his last name in the film.
Matt Damon.
What's your name?
Matt Damon. Like Matt.
Matt Damon.
Yes, exactly.
Matt Damon.
Exactly. Very nice to meet you.
De Niro and Damon, had they known him before?
No, but what interesting was they were doing a Cold War movie.
Oh, really?
So the security guard for for Robert De Niro, he was a security guard, but he was also, his advisor for the movie they were making there. He knew everything about Stanislav's story. We went to the States, it could be like 3 weeks. Then we went to the States 2 times, actually. 2 times, yeah. The first time, I think it was, I can't remember the dates. It could also be like 1 or 2 weeks. The last time, we went all the way through the States. There's lots of places we didn't see. But I think it was fun to go with Stanislav and just see, this country that he has almost been fighting against. I have no doubt when he went to the States, something happened with him, and that was a good thing. He would always be a modest man. I mean, Stanislav is very modest. But I'm sure that he felt like before he died that at least he get that knowledge. The second trip we made to America was, everybody could see how Stanislav was changing. I think black person. And Sonny is sitting there in South Dakota, and all these wonderful black women you are serving him, like big, black, proud mamas, He liked it.
In 2013, he was awarded the Dresden Prize for preventing an armed conflict. He arrived here in Germany again and received the statuette. But that's not all. This award was worth a solid 25,000 euros. Posters of Petrov were all around Dresden. He was again received as a star. He spoke at a press conference, gave an interview, talked to people, and seemed to be getting used to his role as a celebrity. I often wondered why the Western audience loved him so much. Then I looked at his photos from his youth, and it hit me. He was the perfect fit for the pop culture image of Superman. Well-built, handsome, strong, and kind at the same time, and the savior of mankind. What else does an ordinary Westerner need to fall head over heels in love with someone?
The book I wrote is about why we've almost lost our fear of nuclear weapons. It came out in 1984. And when I was at Petrov's, I wanted him to write something in my book. And instead of 2016, he dated it 1916. He was 100 years off. But that night, when everything depended on him, he did everything right. I would say that for me, Stanislav Petrov, along with Mikhail Gorbachev, are the most significant personalities of the 20th century. I don't want to imagine what would have happened had he made a different decision. Billions of people owe it to him. Billions of people owe their lives to him. It's impossible to do more for humanity.
How did your father feel about turning into such a popular person?
He didn't feel anything about it. He didn't consider whatever he had done a heroic thing. He always said, it was my job. Nobody would praise a woman for cooking delicious borscht.
He'd be so gentle and the sweetest, nicest guy. And then suddenly when he got scared, he was during the incident. Because even though you're trained as a soldier, you're never prepared to be a soldier of Third World War. Nobody is. So he would tell me like how dangerous it was. It was scary, it's very dangerous. And he said it destroyed his life at that time. He never told me, but I think he had post-traumatic stress. People go to war. So you could feel that he has a temper who could be very, very nice, and suddenly you press him a little bit too much, you could exploding.
Do you think your father looks like his authentic self in this film?
The thing is, there are scenes where he swears, and it was in his nature, and he did kick the film crew out. After that, they looked at the script and said, we have to keep it realistic. So they put away the script and asked him to be himself. If you don't like something, then just say it on camera. So basically, his swearing was added to the script.
So he is like himself in the movie?
Yes.
Stanislav Petrov himself once told me he'd only been treated unfairly twice. The first time was by his bosses after that night, and the other time it was by the creators of this film. He told me in person that he was portrayed as some kind of a hooligan, and he said, I can be anyone but a hooligan.
Kein Hooligan.
He said he wouldn't go to the festival where this movie was to be shown. On the other hand, I think it's better to have this movie than not have any at all.
Peter Anthony's film is also cool and captivating because Peter has woven a very dramatic personal story of Petrov in there. He had a very tough relationship with his mother, not seeing or talking to her for 20 years. And can you imagine, Peter convinced Petrov that since he had saved the world, he should go and patch things up with his elderly mother, especially since shortly before that, his brother, who was his mother's favorite son, had passed away.
Stanislav's brother who passed away. We got a hold of her, his wife. She was still alive. And we told her, can you make an arrangement? And we told her we're going to come there and film Stanislav meeting his mother. Can you tell his mother that you're going to come and pick her up and you're going to go to the graveyard? Because she expected that her son's wife is coming up to meet her. And she opens the door and suddenly we're there.
Здравствуй, мама. Милая.
Приехал. Зачем?
So yeah, that's how the idea came up. We had to talk him into this. And he was not willing in the beginning. No. It's not very fun to go back to a person you haven't seen for so many years and suddenly have a camera crew with you and all that stuff.
Давай, мам, вот эти фотографии рассмотрим. И вот это вот Роберт Де Ниро. Тоже очень большой актер.
Это его сын?
Нет, это не его сын, это Дэймон. Ой, никак не могу вспомнить его имя.
А я не думал, что я тебя увижу теперь в этой жизни.
Что-то, мама, все хорошо. Я рад теперь с тобой.
Did you understand what happened between them?
I think I understand what happened between them. I think what happened was that you have to understand with Stanislav, he was a young man. Then he was the favorite number one, of course. Then suddenly he has a younger brother who becomes the favorite. Mm-hmm. And suddenly he goes to military. And as I understand, military is very, very rough. It used to be. And suddenly he's forced into the military, go there. And he succeeds. And suddenly he finds out that his brother is not succeeding in anything. And then he realized that his brother was never put into the military by his parents. His mother was always taking care of his younger brother.
So he felt like betrayed by his mother.
It's not that difficult to see that she loved her, the younger brother, more. That's how life is, right? It's not equal.
Petrov had a lot of connections with Ukraine. He studied there. Did he comment on the events of 2014?
He said he didn't know what would come out of it. He was very sorry. He wanted to visit his mum, who was still alive then. She lived in Odessa, and he couldn't go there anymore. That's about it.
So, when he meets his mother in the film, that actually takes place in Odessa.
It had to be Odessa. He wanted to go there. And he told me that he thought he couldn't go there and say goodbye to her.
I'll tell you one more thing about Peter Anthony's movie, The Man Who Saved the World. In 2021, this movie was watched by the famous Pink Floyd frontman, Roger Waters. He was so impressed that he dedicated a special version of the well-known Pink Floyd song, The Gunner's Dream, to Petrov. A soldier is dying, and before he dies, he dreams of a beautiful world without death and murder. Waters wrote this. It's weird to think that had Petrov not been in the right place at the right time, none of us would be alive, and those under the age of 37 would not have been born at all. And he said, "To you, dear Stanislav, I dedicate this song, with our love."
And also, just because when I talk to younger people, they think like, yeah, but today we're a lot different, right? I mean, people go on the internet to understand, oh, no, I would never do that. I would not kill somebody. Well, this was another time. Second World War, the guy who was with Nola dropping a nuclear bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, these guys were not thinking like young people are thinking today. Stanislav was trained to not make a decision, not evaluate inside of his own mind what he thinks is right or wrong. He was supposed to collect data and put it up to the generals. And he didn't do that.
Ich habe immer angerufen zum Geburtstag.
I always called him on his birthday and on Christmas. And when I called him in September 2017 to say happy birthday, his son Dmitry picked up and said to me, "My father is dead."
Father dead. Wow. in April. That was
Back in April, 6 months ago, he told me that his father had died, and I sent a message to the newspaper, writing there that he had died.
Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am glad to see that so many have come here to this park on Weststrasse in Osterfeld to attend the unveiling of a memorial plaque in memory of Stanislav Petrov. Stanislav Petrov is the man who saved the world from World War III in 1983. We must always remember him. He saved millions of people in Germany, Europe, the USA, and in his homeland.
In den Handflächen sammelt sich der Schweiß. Mein Hemd ist nass. Mein Herz gefriert zu Eis.
Sweat collects in the palms of my hands. My shirt is wet. My heart freezes to ice. God damn it, why me? I press the little red button. The missiles are going to take off. The cruel God has his hands on my throat. I don't want it. I can't do it. I refuse the order. Darkness dissolved. Let me see the light. I don't believe in God and I don't pray. I will be death for millions. No, I will preserve my dignity. I am a human. Why do you think he is more famous in the West than in Russia?
The thing is, in general, we have a huge country, and we have many heroes. And it so happens that we can't possibly pay tribute to every one of them. Or maybe it's just, there are heroes, so what? This attitude. I don't know for sure. He never really aspired to fame.
Ich kann Ihnen eines sagen, weil es mir gerade so einfällt.
Here's what I can say. Stanislav Petrov wouldn't leave Russia or Moscow for any money. He wouldn't have done it. That's how close he was to his people and his land.
Was he a patriot?
What does it mean to be a patriot? Define being a patriot to me.
It's loving your motherland.
Der liebt?
In that case, yes. He loved his motherland. In spite of all the contradictions, he was Russian. No questions asked.
Keine Frage.
This is your first time here in town since 1991. You have not been here for 31 years. How do you feel? How much has it changed?
Well, all the buildings are pretty much the same. Nothing changed there. The trees have gotten bigger. It's all full of trees now. They used to be smaller.
Serpukhov 15 ceased to be a closed town in 2012. Since then, it has been the scene of ordinary Russian life. There's some kind of market, some other places to shop. In fact, when the so-called closed administrative territories were opening up in Russia, many residents were against it, including those here. Because as soon as all this was out of the control of the Ministry of Defense, they started dividing the land between districts and even between regions. In 2016, despite the protests of its residents, Marinki became part of Kaluga Oblast, even though Moscow Oblast is very close and its residents receive more benefits. Interesting, though, that the life of most people in this town is still connected with the military unit where Petrov served, which still exists. So here, most of the locals are either military, you see a lot of people wearing a uniform, or have military personnel in their family, or they are state employees who keep this town alive. There is one school and one bank branch. It's just like everywhere else.
The Oko system stopped working quite some time ago. And now, to create a new space system called Kupol, they use satellite devices known as Tundra. They cover the whole northern hemisphere and all missile-prone areas there.
Many people believe that nuclear war is a terrible echo of the past. But I'm sure that this opinion will radically change.
When that missile or missile debris fell in Poland, I felt as bad as I felt in 1983. I don't want this beautiful world where we can travel and see how much beauty there is to be destroyed. And I don't want it to be our fault, the fault of people.
I would put it this way. The whole period of the Cold War nuclear arms race, there was a certain kind of restraint that I like to call the taboo. And that is because people realized that nuclear war would be so horrific, would be the end of mankind. You know, what will happen with this nuclear weapon or that one? But I think the big problem is the threats themselves are eroding this taboo that we had, eroding this barrier that we had, and that's not a good idea.
There can't be a winner in a nuclear war. The winner will live 20 minutes longer, but those 20 minutes won't be very pleasant. So, it's not worth it. In my opinion, the problem is different, and Stanislav Petrov also didn't understand something. Only in one case I allowed myself to correct him. He said many times that we should all be brothers. But fratricidal wars have been going on since the beginning of time, since the biblical Cain killed Abel. So just being brothers is not enough. It doesn't change anything. I think differently. We need to be friends. We don't have to be brothers.
Weapons targeting systems are getting more and more accurate, and warning times are getting shorter. You don't need a lot of imagination to predict how it all ends. Because sooner or later a time will come when all nuclear powers delegate the decision of whether our planet should exist or not to artificial intelligence. So there will be no person in the worst case. And in the best case, there will be a person with 10 minutes to listen to their conscience and make a human decision.
That Stanislav did something that 99% people wouldn't do. A man was not supposed to be there, his wife gets sick, somebody gets sick at the office, he goes there, he's an engineer, would never be an engineer in that position, be like a real soldier standing there, and suddenly he has to make the decision.
He is the hero of our time. I am now wondering if there will be any more heroes who will make the right decision for humanity, for the planet, when the time comes.
The thing is that he did not consider himself a hero because that was his job. It just was interesting for him to be useful.
And he was at the right time, at the right place.
Well, fate had decided it.
Fate?
Well, yeah. Most likely fate.
Well, dear friends, as usual on our channel, you can draw all the conclusions yourselves. All these years, there have been quite a few skeptics who tried to prove that Petrov did not prevent anything because he couldn't press the red button, even in theory, and couldn't start a war. And that this whole story is greatly overblown. You also see online discussions like that from time to time. Here's my personal opinion. I think that Petrov is nevertheless a hero. Because the Soviet system, and especially the Soviet military system, was always following the principle of not taking any responsibility, of not bearing the blame, of covering up with an order, an instruction, some other norm. And if that night Petrov had been following that logic, a completely different report would have been made. If every cog of this system had turned based on that logic as well, then the probability of nuclear war starting on that night would have been much higher. How much higher? Would it have started? Of course, we can't know that. But because there was a man who was not afraid to take on this huge responsibility, to take the blame, it all worked out as a protective mechanism. And it was protective for all of us, for all of humanity. After all, Petrov himself liked to say that as long as there are nuclear weapons, there is always a chance someone will want to use them. And thanks to Petrov, we know that there is also the chance that there will be a man who won't do this. This was Redaxia. Leave your comments and likes below. Subscribe to our channel. See you soon.